Hi, everyone. Okay, so I'm Evan Feigenbaum. I'm vice chairman of the Institute, and I see a lot of familiar faces. So, hi, Ted. This is the latest in our series of monthly Contemporary China Talks, which are co-sponsored by the Paulson Institute and the Harris School, which is the public policy school on campus. I'm going to say, as is my style, we just want to get right to it. So I'm going to say one thing about the Institute, and then one thing about today. On the Institute, as those of you, well, many of you have been here before, but those who don't know us, we are on the campus, but not necessarily of the campus in the sense that we are not a constituent part of the University of Chicago. But we do a lot of things on campus, and we do a lot of things in particular with students. And so we just had a year of the horse celebration, and so a lot of people came by, and we hope you'll keep doing that. Our door is open, come knock. If you're interested in China, and especially contemporary China, we want you, students, faculty, others, to think of us as a resource on campus and a place you want to be involved with. There are two things I might just flag. One is that we have summer internships, and since it's spring break and summer is rapidly approaching, we have two kinds of internships. One is internships related to the future of cities and urban sustainability in China. So if you're interested in that, apply. We have internships in China as well as in the United States. And the other is a set of internships focused on conservation of natural resources in the environment. So we also have conservation internships. So another set of issues people may be interested in, but we've had quite a good number of students on campus do these with us now. So go on the website, learn more. For those of you who are doctoral students, we also give pre-doctoral fellowships for fieldwork in China. So those of you who are ABD and are looking for fieldwork support, it's a rigorous process, need a proposal, recommendations and so on, but please find out more and think about applying. This is the latest in our series. We do this every month, guys, and as those of you who've been here before know, we've done intellectual history with Orville Schell. We've done economic models and lots of data and statistics up on the screen from Yukon Huang. We had Jim McGregor talking about business and the party, and we've been wanting, me and Damien Ma, who organized this series, to do something on social trends for a while. And especially since we know Ken and Rachel's local, and I think some of your students are in the audience. And I can't think of anybody really better to talk about social trends, media, things that are happening. As with our other speakers, two people who've had very diverse backgrounds and experiences with China. Ken, first as an academic, but now very far afield in business, but still applying a lot of the lessons you've learned to your many years working with China. And Rachel, who's been involved with China in so many ways, writing, living, thinking, soap opera star for a while, and now a novelist here in Chicago. So we're delighted to welcome them, and we're delighted that you're all here. So what we usually do is we'll have you talk for a while, 40 minutes or so, and then take some questions from the audience, and I'll let you take those yourself. Okay?
Very good.
Thanks for joining us. All right, please join me in welcoming Ken and Rachel DeWoskin.
Thank you guys for having us. We're delighted to be here. So we thought we'd start with a Chinese expression, which is 上有政策,下有对策, which means when a formal policy comes down from above, a counter policy comes up from below. And we're going to show a very brief video clip, which has two components. And one is a formal policy from above, and the other is a counter policy from below. Do you want to talk about the content of these a little bit, and then we'll put them on?
Sure. First, thanks for coming today. It's a real pleasure to see all of you. This audience actually uniquely comes from a whole bunch of different parts of my life, so it constitutes considerable risk. Our relatives here, Ed from the early days of pre-imperial China, all the way up to Hank Paulson, today's China. So it's exciting to try to speak to the interests of such a broad group. It's great to be able to talk about media, because you can use media to maybe make a more compelling presentation than we could do simply by talking about things. So we have a couple of short clips, and each of these clips is designed around something promoted by the center and then something that comes up more from popular culture. to show you kind of the balance. The interesting thing is that all of these are available essentially through the same channels in China. So in spite of what you read about channel control, in fact, there's incredible access to very large audiences, both by the party, Central, the Propaganda Bureau, and all of the cultural producers in that world, as well as just about anybody who's got a cell phone that can do a video clip and upload it from that. So the first thing we have is a pair of presentations, one from Xi Jinping's very recent, one of his several appearances around Chinese New Year. This is in the Great Hall of the People, where he's addressing a number of tables of people that represent various kinds of pieces of Chinese society, you might say. I can guarantee that this piece will not be overstimulating. It's sort of an almost bizarrely low affect presentation of the President and General Secretary. The messaging here is really around three things. It's one around inclusiveness. It's one around stability and continuity. And it's one around the sort of steadfastness and infallibility of the leadership. In part because in China today, I think a growing number of people believe that the thing that stands between China today, the growth and the lifestyle that people have become accustomed to, and total chaos is the leaders, and almost the infallibility, almost kind of a papal infallibility that is ascribed to the leaders. So that's what this presentation about. The next one I want to warn you about has some crude language in it, so I don't see anybody here who looks like they're younger than 13. This is definitely a parental guidance piece. This is from a kind of crude anime piece called Piercing, which is much more a kind of example of the perception that comes up from the bottom of certain aspects of the society, including a very interesting perception of the global financial crisis. So let me set you going with these. The Xi Jinping piece is not translated, but basically he goes to these various tables, and the video follows the tables he's talking about. So I like it because he ends up with the old ganbu, the old cadres, who are sitting there looking a little bit doting, but otherwise okay.
人民大会堂宴会厅灯光明亮，舞台上的大红春字朴素典雅，人们的欢声笑语传递着祥和喜庆的节日气息。上午10时，在欢快的乐曲声中，党和国家领导人步入会场，全场响起热烈掌声。中共中央总书记、国家主席、中央军委主席习近平主持团拜会。他说：“
在中华民族的传统节日春节即将到来之际，我们欢聚一堂，共迎新春佳节。我代表中共中央、国务院，向全国各族人民，向广大工人、农民、知识分子和干部，向人民解放军指战员、武警官兵和公安民警，向各民主党派和工商联、各人民团体和各界人士表示诚挚的慰问。向全国离退休老干部、老同志致以诚挚的问候。
别砸了，怪可怜的。
你可怜他，谁他妈的可怜我们啊？
行了，比起文川这群人民，我们算幸福的了。
靠，真他妈的阿 Q， 搞得像公务员一样。
我要是公务员就好了。
别做美梦了。你说我弄点摇头丸在这里面怎么样？
这里除了我们俩没人啊。
哎呀。我说的是夏天，夏天这里成天都是人啊。
是啊，现在要是夏天就好了。 看看老头老太跳迪斯，可见好打发呀。
哈哈哈哈！吃他妈的什么脑白金啊！要吃就吃摇头丸，老胳膊老腿的能跳上一个晚上呢。哈哈哈哈！
行了行了，还是找个正经工作吧。
哼，到哪找？一个大学生都找不到工作，我还找什么找啊？
我准备回老家了，你也一起回去吧。
回去？回去干嘛？种地、养猪啊？你能受得了？我他妈的才不回去呢！老子喜欢城里，这么多的楼，这么多的人，这么多的车，就是老子死也要死在城里。
现在金融危机嘛，这个打仗，哎呀，
金融危机？我问你，金融危机前你存多少钱？那现在金融危机了，你存多少钱？
没有存钱啊。
还是不要学别人动不动就谈金融危机。我告诉你，金融危机呢跟咱们没得关系。没有金融危机，你是穷人；有金融危机，你也是穷人，晓得吗
Okay, that's piercing. I'll leave to you to decide which of those gets the most hits online. You could guess. Anyway, the way that we frame these to sort of think about what real change is taking place in China goes way back in history, because I think one of the curious and well, not curious, but maybe unique aspects of China is that control of both the channels and the content of communication has been a central role of Chinese leadership from actually way before Imperial China was established in the 3rd century BC. If you think about it, you know, as many of you know about oracle bone culture, bronze culture, silk culture, bamboo slip writing, and all of the long traditions of Chinese writing, which really begin with oracle bones, these are materials that were actually part of the government treasury, essentially. And the use of literacy all the way up to the exam system, and then actually even reiterated in Mao Zedong's talks at Yan'an, the use of literacy and the channels of communication were a critical part of the government technology or mechanisms for maintaining order. So you had an unusual situation even coming into the 20th century. One of the first things the party did when it began meeting formally in 1921 was to get control of the journals that were popularly read. And the army, even to today, is a major player in things like printing and paper making and sort of the traditional means of communication. So control of the channel of communications was much more under the central authority in China than was in Europe. China did not have a kind of a church-state divide where scholasticism, the non-vernacular literature, the keeping of history was actually outside the secular authority, which certainly shaped our tradition in a certain way. China was much more controlled and uniform. So we have a couple of major changes with the technology. And the technology, you know, I tend to organize these in sort of 3 different ways. One is that we have for the first time access by the public to channels that reach a very broad audience. This is really an extremely new thing. You can't imagine a time, even prior to, say, 1990 or 1995, when China ever faced a situation, when Chinese rulers ever faced a situation where the public itself had direct access to channels of communication that could reach a very large audience. Secondly, there is a commercialization of information which didn't exist before. We see it from time to time, the Song Dynasty, we have urbanization dynamic and commercial printing and things like that, but relatively small phenomena. So even within the government apparatus, you have, for example, provincial broadcasting companies and film companies that are really trying to make cultural products that have public appeal. There's very little worry about public appeal in Xi Jinping's presentation here. You can see that. I mean, he barely even lifts his face out of the papers. It's something he does. Everybody respects it for what it is, but it's not something that is extremely engaging or exciting to the public. And then the third thing, of course, is just part of the dynamic of globalization, and that is the extent to which the door is truly open to the outside world. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail on what it means, but it basically also leads to a couple of rather unprecedented features. The first of which is the exposure to a formal media structure, sort of fifth estate structure, which the government does not control directly. So unlike things like unlike things like the China Daily, the People's Daily, Global Times, CCTV, we have Bloomberg and we have the New York Times looking in on what's going on in China. And in particular, we'll again talk about this a little bit later, but the nature of the economy is such now that there are things that the leadership would prefer not be explored, but are explorable by, say, the New York Times. So that's a very big change. Secondly, it's not difficult, no matter what the firewall is in China and how tightly internet is actually controlled there. It's not at all difficult to hook up a VPN and get access to anything, YouTube, New York Times, Bloomberg, and the things that are controlled. And through channels like pirated DVDs and officially allowed video that comes in, there's a huge exposure to the outside world. So think about the whole phenomenon of television, the whole phenomenon of the internet, the whole phenomenon then the subcultures of reality TV, soap operas, and all these sorts of things. They're all basically imports. Didn't exist before. And they are channels of very important cultural transmissions. So we'll look a little bit more in detail at that. But this has led to a formal concern recently, which I think really began to surface during the early days of the 12th five-year plan, which was 2010 going into effect in 2011, about cultural production and the generating of both policies and resources that are being formally put into cultural production. So let me go back to our cultural expert.
Last week, actually, the China Daily ran a piece that's both frank and unclear about a new policy that China has unveiled to boost the creative industry. What's not clear is what they're doing to boost it. But what's clear is that there are two dimensions to the goal. And one is, I think, a kind of commercial dimension. So you have a movie like Avatar come to China and both inspire people to go to the theaters and make hundreds of millions of dollars. And the central government asks, how do we get people into the theater so that we can convey to them the messages we'd prefer to convey, which are not, in fact, the messages Avatar conveys. And then there's the soft power dimension, whereby you have a movie like Kung Fu Panda, which creates a lot of angst in China because why is Hollywood telling a story about China? And if stories about China are going to be told either domestically or globally, then China would prefer to be in control of the content of those stories. And of course, what Mao said in Yan'an was that if you're going to tell messages to the people, you have to package them in the medium the people prefer. So sometimes that medium is literature. Sometimes it's soap operas, sometimes it's animated cartoons on Youku. Whatever it is, you have to be in control of the content and the channel. So that creates the problem of all tempt and teach literature. If you tempt people too much, you may teach them the wrong thing. Foreign Babes in Beijing is a great example of this. We'll talk about that in detail toward the end. But you have to figure out how to make a Chinese epic that competes with Avatar. So maybe the Monkey King, they're working on a Monkey King movie. Or you have to create a Chinese version of Kung Fu Panda. What is it, Kung Fu Rabbit?
Yeah, the true legacy of Kung Fu Rabbit.
The true legacy of Kung Fu Rabbit, which is
in which the
Chinese...
panda is the bad guy.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
Oddly enough.
Go ahead.
No.
Lei Feng.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yes. We have known each other for 40 years, but have rarely been able
Even though I'm 28, it's so weird.
We've rarely been able to coordinate anything. So this was a real challenge. Yeah, so a couple more video clips. Since most of us, I think, believe more or less in free markets, we're very skeptical of the viability of a centrally planned economy, or let's say centrally planned dictates about technology development and centrally planned, government-planned investment. So it's particularly curious and interesting to think about the potential of centrally planned creativity. And if we got a bill out of Washington that proposed massive investments in the creative industries, well, we sort of have it with the National Endowment of Humanities, I guess, but it's not really a centrally planned mentality. So this recent notion that the central government can promote creative industries and promote cultural production and even promote the impact of Chinese soft power around the world is a little bit curious. It tends not to work terribly well. And, you know, for examples of that, we looked at this year's New Year Gala that was created and presented by CCTV. This is an event that happens every year. Every year it gets bigger and better. Every year another couple 100 million people watch it. All of the important stars and celebrities in China, they're kind of obligated to appear on this. It's a part of their demonstration of patriotism. So this is a thing that goes on for 3.5 hours actually. Almost nothing else on TV during the Chinese Gala. But as you wouldn't be surprised to learn that when you start to try to direct the production of cultural things centrally, you actually end up kind of going backwards. So we're going to show another two things now. One is a clip, which will be very familiar to those of you who are older and have been around for a while, of one of the featured events at this year's 2014. This happened just 2 or 3 weeks ago. New Year's event in China, actually about a month ago now, a month and a half ago, because it was, I guess, early February. No, it was end of January, actually. And then it's going to be followed by a cartoon, again, that comes up from the bottom. So it's another down from the top and up from the bottom piece. And let me see if
This cartoon, incidentally, is an absolutely viral video on Youku.
Yeah, and it's a little nasty, too. So those of you with... Well, it's hard to decide which part of this is nastier. Here we go. We're ready to go. Can we have sound on this? Some music you don't want to miss. This is 2014. This doesn't go on too much longer, I promise. I just want you to see the last heroic moment before we go to the bunny rabbits. I'm going to pause this for a minute, though. I'm going to pause this for a minute because I want to, for those of you not familiar with common public grievances, this is a very compact little piece, but it touches a tremendous range of ingredients, of public issues. The first, you may be familiar with the milk scandals that unfolded in China, essentially simultaneous to the 2008 Olympics.
Toxic baby formula.
Yeah, that was the Sanlu company, the Three Deer company. In this video, you'll see the Sanhu, the Three Tiger company, come and deliver milk. But it's got this collection of things. I tried to make a list of everything that's in here. It's a little bit of an ironic comment, actually, on what Chairman Mao had said at Yan'an, because it really is something that engages public interest because it touches on the interests of the proletariat, but not quite in the way maybe that he envisioned it. So we have the milk scandal, we have land grabs and the crushing of people's houses, we have the complete lack of recourse before party officials at the local level, we have the privilege of party officials, all of those things, and then in a sense the violence that is becoming increasingly common in what really is an increasingly kind of coercive environment in some parts of China. So all these things are packed in these very few minutes here. So.
小白兔白又白，两只耳朵竖起来，蹦蹦跳跳真可爱，爱吃萝卜爱吃菜，爱吃菜。
小 把嘴巴张开，快点儿张开，活出幸福未来耶。
So,
pretty angry piece.
In case that didn't speak for itself, the rabbits are obviously metaphors for the Lao Bai Sing, the commoners, being slaughtered by many scandals and many kind of evil forces. And it's like, it reminds me of pre-imperial book of songs, the Shijing, in which the rats come and eat all the grain, and yet everybody in the Chinese audience, and the Chinese audience is composed of sophisticated consumers of moral drama, I think, and always has been. So they watch that and they know exactly who the rabbits are. They read the Shijing and they know that the rats are in fact tax collectors. Or they read the channels of information and they know how to evade the top-down control of language or control of content. So one of my favorite examples of this is on Chinese Weibo, Chinese Twitter. When the artist Ai Weiwei became controversial, you were suddenly not allowed to post anything that included his name without your post being immediately deleted. And so netizens changed his name to Ai Weilai, which is a patriotic slogan. It means I love the future. It's only one character off from Ai Weiwei. And of course, everybody immediately knew that Ai Weilai was just a stand-in for Ai Weiwei. And so in this way, people continue to have whatever the conversation is that they would like to be having. And to kind of use whatever the medium is to push the boundaries of public discourse and to widen it, to open it. There's always a language underneath the formal language coming up from the bottom, and it's constantly changing. It has a kind of tunneling effect. And it moves very quickly. It moves online, and when you take a nursery rhyme and you animate it, and then that's the content, you create this second version underneath whatever is the official version of events or things.
Yeah, so the capacity really to, sort of for freedom of expression actually exceeds what we normally would think exists. I myself am surprised that that little rabbit thing is still circulating freely in China, but it circulates very freely, so. I mean, it's not, you don't have to be a literary critic to understand what that one's about, for sure.
Although, let me say one thing about censorship that fits into that, which is that I've been historically surprised by what the censors focus in on and what they delete and what they excuse. It's capricious in a certain way, or anyway, it's difficult to understand exactly what the configuration is. So for example, my friend who's a Chinese filmmaker made a film maybe 8 or 9 years ago, which he called The Perfect Woman. And it was a film about contemporary China and about the difficulty of remaining ethical in a corrupt society. a difficulty we all face, no matter what country we live in. And he, when he went to the censors, had several predictable discussions with them about content they felt pushed the envelope too far. But their main gripe was that they disliked the title. They just didn't think that A Perfect Woman fit the film. And they preferred the title Jingar, manhole, because the opening sequence of the film featured some peasant stealing the cover of a manhole to melt it down for cash. And he accommodated that. He called the movie Manhole, Jingar. So you don't always get exactly what you think you're going to get in terms of the system by which things are changed and turned into other things. And the rabbit video is an interesting example of that. You can find it anywhere.
Yeah. So, you know, I want to look a little bit deeper into the real changes, I think, being affected through these channels. I mentioned three things before, and I want to go a little bit more into detail. The first really is the notion of a free press and whether or not in today's world you can actually control the press. The top party levels have not stopped trying to control the press in China, but they find themselves exposed to global media that they don't have direct control over. So we are right now in a period of tightening. There have been instructions that have come down just in the last 3 weeks about what kind of stories can be told more or less independently by Chinese media and what stories cannot be told independently by Chinese media. You know, for example, you might be surprised that Chinese media are not permitted now by a dictate from the State Council to report anything about economic reforms that is not formally issued by Xinhua News Agency. And that's because there began to be some discussion in the media about the pace of reforms and the direction they were really going in. Unfortunate accident that happened in Kunming in the train station, the knife attacks that have been variously described. There's a lot of discussion online about whether those were really perpetrated by Uyghurs or whether it had to do something else to do with what were essentially Bo Xilai loyalists remaining in this sort of southwestern quadrant of China, and gang warfare, which is very characteristic of Chongqing. I mean, those of you who are Chinese, follow these events, you know that this is part of the story. The Crimean issue is a very big issue for China because they would like to be supportive of Russia. The idea of having an ethnic subculture within your country vote for independence, as you might imagine, doesn't ride that well with the problems in Xinjiang and the problems in Tibet, or the issues in Tibet. So it's very difficult. So that content has also been restricted. And what we're seeing is more and more things which the domestic media is not really permitted to report on that are being now added to this list by the central government, where very close instructions come down. But the reality is, in a world like today, you have things like the what are called the Hongsa-Guizi, the sort of red aristocracy, making quite a lot of money, especially in financial services today. And in order to do that, they need to be active in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong has a set of, you know, internationally sort of consistent rules, for example, about disclosure of the ultimate ownership of equity in big corporations. And so while the Beijing has taken the steps to bar the issuing of visas to New York Times reporters now, and Bloomberg reporters, and those sites are blocked in China, the reality is that good investigative reporters in all of these sort of world-class investigative newspapers can get the information they need to do stories that are very unwelcome in Beijing. And they've done that on a couple of issues now, and there's, you know, some controversy about whether Bloomberg itself is quashing stories in an effort to get access again. I don't know, I don't have an opinion on that, but the reality is that this is a very big change because the control of media is really beyond control now, in a sense because of the exposure, the open door policy. Second is just on the style and content of what is available on the media and what is actually created. So the notion of things like that, that first thing we showed from piercing, you know, it's kind of, seems to me like a descendant of Beavis and Butthead or South Park. I mean, it's just very, very basic, crude, not only crude animation, but very crude language and a crude, blunt perspective on things that are of interest to people. This is very, very uncharacteristic of anything we've ever seen before, really. You know, you may have the great Sung poet Su Dongpo writing things which, as Rach was saying, you know, are metaphorically deeply embedded, criticism of the government deeply embedded in some eloquent, you know, poetic metaphor. but you don't have Beavis and Butthead before. This is really quite a dramatic change. So these content frameworks, which are very common to us and very well known to us, are really quite novel in China, but in a sense unstoppable. There's really no way to filter this out.
And I don't think the government wants to filter it out. I think
probably not.
One of the things about Weibo is that the government also gets its information about individuals via these cartoons. People in the central planning positions are also watching Weibo and watching Tudo and thinking about what the positions of regular people are. So there's a lot of two-way flow of information.
Yeah, exactly. And then along with it comes even the notion of what constitutes a good program, an appealing program. So we've had this inflow of reality TV ideas. And reality TV ideas really constitute a special kind of challenge if you have a content control mentality, because they do show the lives of people. And again, sort of like piercing, it's very easy to go over a line. It's very easy, actually, very difficult in some ways to import a framework like that, but not import some of the values that are implicit in it. And I think that's the struggle we see unfolding now. So this is sort of the final chapter in the open door as far as media is concerned. The channel is there, the internet is there. When the government tries to crack down on Weibo, people just shift over to WeChat. You know, it's very easy to see very large population shifts going from one platform to another. It's a very mobile culture, it's a very connected culture. People move very quickly between these things. They have all sorts of devices for managing in the environment they work in. But when you start to import things like American Idol in the form of something like Superboy and Supergirl, then you have all sorts of problems that censors begin to think about and address that might surprise you and haven't thought of you. So to kind of wrap this up, we have an example of one of the flies who came into the door in the form of Rachel. It's not recorded. She's here in person. Culturally subversive.
If you open the door, some flies will come in. Maybe not everybody knows this awesome quotation. But so the reality TV world is a very interesting example of the problem of cultural imports or cultural adaptations. So you have American Idol in the States, and then you have the sort of Chinese version of American Idol, which is Mongolian sour yogurt Supergirl voice competition. But when you import a product, let's say you import Coca-Cola, you also get with Coca-Cola carefree love of fun, which you may not want even while you're drinking soda. Or you import Marlboros and you get rugged individualism, which you may not want as a culture. So you import a show like Supergirl yogurt competition and you get voting. Because this is a show where you vote for the contestant you prefer, and you do that via SMS or via text. And it introduces a very complicated set of problems, both for the producers who are trying to make money, and for the censors who are trying to, well, there's two ways of thinking about what the censors are trying to do. On the one hand, they may be trying to create morally essential and meaningful content, or they may be trying to make content that looks like it's morally presentable or good. So you have a show like Sour Yogurt Supergirl, and there's a lot of screaming, there's a lot of fandom, and at the end you have an individual who wins at the expense of everybody else, all of the losing contestants, and she's been voted in democratically. Not a good situation. So then the follow-up to that show is Superboy voice competition. And SARFT, the State Administration of Radio, Film, and TV, issues a top-down edict saying no hysteria. They use the word hysteria. No crying, no screaming or clapping, no suspense, no emotional outbursts. And I spent a summer in Beijing following around one of the judges on Superboy, very interesting woman named Yang Archanamu, who is actually grew up in a matrilinear society in southern China, and is a hybrid of many things. And one of those things is a feminist, and another one is a provocateur. She's like the Paula Abdul of China. And she was getting texts all day long, simultaneous and contradictory texts from the producers, Hunan Television, and from the State Administration of Radio and Television, down to don't wear those earrings or we're firing you, from SARFT, and you better wear the heels or you're off, from the producers. It was a literal, constant, two-dimensional compression of this woman. So the show was not as big a success. And then the third show, where it was called something like Everybody Can Sing, Everybody Wins, was a total disaster. Nobody watched it. They caught the voting, they caught the scandal, they fired Namu. So an early vision of this problem, the kind of the risk of all tempt and teach literature, all tempt and teach television, and all commercial television, frankly, is of course Foreign Babes in Beijing. And I've had a unique opportunity to consider deeply the moral nuance of that show because I participated in it without talent, qualification, or preliminary consideration. I was cast in Foreign Babes in Beijing in 1995 because some guy saw me at a bar and said, "You're American, do you want to be in my soap opera?" And I, with a corporate job I disliked, said, "Why not?" It turns out there were actually many reasons why not. But it took me years to sort those out. And Foreign Babes at its core was at least a dual show. There was the show that the censors said they were making, which was a moral tale of the dangers associated with importing Western women and liberties and licentiousness and products, air conditioners, hamburgers, condominiums. And then there was actually the show that they made and everybody watched, which was just standard TV fare. Bling, good girl, bad girl, false dichotomies, this kind of thing. I played the bad girl who fell in love with Chinese culture and Chinese men. It was also a way to suggest the problematic conversation about interracial romance without actually addressing the reality, which was that at least in those days, most of those relationships were between Western men and Chinese women. But it was not, they were not going to depict that side of it. It's way too contentious. So I'm going to show a 3-minute clip from Foreign Babes in Beijing. It's both a very frank and a very sort of murky conversation about Western imports in China. And then we'll take questions about whatever people want to talk about, hear your thoughts, have a dialogue.
Yeah, let me just add that here's another deep traditional element, though, is that China has a long history of actually extremely lurid pornographic literature. Jinping Mei, Robutuan, some of you may know those names, but they always include a preface about the intent of these productions is to be to provide moral guidance.
This is Foreign Babes is a very mild show.
Well, it depends on whether you're a father or the actress, I guess. We won't belabor that point. I think we're ready to go with that.
It's on.
Okay.
I Beijing. I love Beijing. It was dubbed, by the way.
但是罗伯特有这种勇气。天亮，现在你有勇气在他面前拥抱路易莎吗？
你还等什么呀？你还等什么呀？
如果你爱路易莎，那为什么不？
上啊！给咱们中国爷们儿争口气！哎，急死我了！
This is the first hug.
打扰你，我可以坐下吗？我只想问你，是不是也在做那种学外语的游戏？你直接说好了。
你侮辱了我的人格，洛特先生。
是吗？我不认为是这样。难道你不正是从学外语开始，到今天，把他搂在你的怀里，接下去，你就和他上床，出国？
你给我闭嘴！
他们就像日本的柔道样子，帅极了。后来，罗伯特从地上爬起来，开始拳击。罗伯特的出拳很快，可是他的力量不够，基本上没有击中。可是天亮，他的跆拳道 太棒了，就像这样。
哎，小姐，你还是坐着说吧啊。
罗伯特，我想对你说，作为天亮的未婚妻，我说一声谢谢。
谢谢你。
别护着他，你这么闹啊，我这酒都喝不痛快。这叫什么呀？这找对象啊，老老实实找个中国人，跟大嫂似的多好啊！这整天跟老外泡在一块儿。
您这是老脑筋。国家现在讲究是开放搞活。
Great. So one quick thing about foreign babes in Beijing. So some of the Western media, after the show aired, felt that it was a propaganda machine, and that it was demonized foreign girls and made us look loose-moraled, which was partially true. But it was also true that as a propaganda machine, it imparted the wrong moral message. Because after the show was on television, people followed me and the German girl who played Louisa through markets and literally bought whatever we were buying. It was usually esoteric electronic components and condiments. And they wanted to be like the liberated foreign girls. They didn't want to be virtuous and scorned. I mean, the Chinese wife character in Foreign Babes, from whom my character steals the handsome Chinese guy, she's not aspirational. And I don't know whether that was an accident or a kind of cynical decision. But the liberty part of Foreign Babes in Beijing was just unabashedly desirable. There was nothing about the Western freedom or the achievements of the Foreign Babes that was even murky. The final sequence of Foreign Babes in Beijing, the 21st episode, is a scene of inevitable exodus. Tianming, the brother of the innocent Chinese guy who marries Louisa, he and I leave for America. And there's a huge sweeping shot of pigeons flying overhead and then an airplane among them. And so in a way, the end of Foreign Babes in Beijing is best case scenario. You have one son stay in China to yanglao, to cultivate the old people in their dotage. My own plan, my own filial plan. And then you have one son who goes abroad to build cultural bridges with the West. And you get in the mix a foreign daughter-in-law who will try to roll attractive dumplings and hopefully give you a grandson to embrace. And then you have this bridge to America as well. So this was by no kind of good ethical deciding on my part, but ultimately the push of the show was positive. I don't think it was that xenophobic in the final analysis, thankfully.
Just two quick things about that. One, the audience was estimated at 600 million.
Yeah.
The thing played again and again and again and again, and then there was really a year of clampdown when we saw old military films from the 40s and 50s.
Right.
So
in the primetime slot,
shift back.
replacing Foreign Babes.
The other thing is that event was the occasion for the first and only time our family's been featured in the National Enquirer. So on that note, I think we're...
That's true.
Yeah, well, so we're happy to take questions now. I don't know where we are time-wise, because we don't have watches up here. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about the first clip, the Xi Jinping clip. You said that there's no effort to engage the outside audience, and I was wondering, is that why? I mean, it seems so aggressively low tech and low-fi. I mean, he's got no teleprompter. He's literally holding the piece of paper in his hand. The government is capable of putting on a better show than that. Why make it so slow and boring in that way?
Because I think there's nothing at stake. Yeah, when I look at that, I wonder, well, why isn't there like a teleprompter? You know, you would think that there, I mean,
I'd say he's very different though. He's done a lot that's extemporaneous.
Yeah.
And where he's animated and where he's done things that I've never seen a Chinese leader do before in terms of to connect. So he's making more of an effort. The question I have for you is, where do you think this is all leading? If you look ahead 10, 15, 20 years. the media, freedom of expression, liberties, those kinds of things. At the same time, you've got economic reform. That's a question everybody sort of asks themselves.
Right.
Do you think that you made the point that it's a two-way street, so leaders are tuned in to what people are thinking, they're listening. Do you think they're going to keep responding to the inevitable need, or do you think there's going to be a clash, between, censorship and the need for expression?
Yeah.
Let me say something brief, and then maybe you can respond in depth. There's a kind of, when I talk to people about Weibo, 2 years ago I wrote a piece for Vanity Fair about Chinese Twitter. And this was my question. The question is, are things continuing to open endlessly until we have a kind of a free and open conversation there? Or is the clampdown gonna get more and more aggressive until they shut down these channels? And my feeling is it's neither, that it feels like whack-a-mole, where something pops up and they beat it down, and then over here something else pops up. And it's a constant liquid process, but that's kind of staying it almost feels like a plateau. It doesn't feel to me like the opening is getting better and better, or more and more open, or people are having more and more freedom, or that they're clamping down harder.
Do you think that's sustainable?
I think it's sustainable for a long time, actually. Yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
It is the toughest question, and my own views change all the time on that, and even the recent events in Russia have, I think, made a lot of the MNC executives I talk to rethink things. Yeah, we tend to forget that these changes we've lived through in the last 3 decades are only 3 decades long, and that these are large dictatorships essentially, and they can change very, very quickly. So executives trying to land in Moscow are finding that they're told they have a speeding ticket and they can't come in. There's real pressure, as you well know, against multinational corporations now in Russia. And if the situation with sanctions gets more and more tense, the environment's going to become increasingly hostile for businesses there. So that's a kind of a reference point, but it's a reminder of how short-term these openings and freedoms really are, because in China it's really less than 2 decades that this kind of development is accelerated. So I tend to think that you can sort of take the cat is out of the bag approach to things, or you could believe that the leadership could take draconian measures. I'm discomforted. And it's something we've actually talked about in fora in China recently. I'm discomforted by the level of people-to-people anxiety that is being generated around the world, not just in China. Many of you probably read the Xinhua news agency Farewell to Ambassador Locke, which was kind of it's hard to find the right word. Did you read that document where they called him a banana and rotting from the inside, and that when he came to China, he brought the pollution. Now that he's leaving China, the sky is blue again. It was unbelievable. He gave a very gracious final presentation. And on Weibo, there were many, many citizens who expressed shock at what their own government had done with that. But every day in the official media, you read extremely aggressive anti-Japanese editorials and extremely aggressive anti-American editorials. And then this drumbeat of sort of anti-American activities, complaining about Starbucks charging too much for coffee in China, Walmart serving or selling pork that is not what it's supposed to be, the pharma companies cheating, contamination, and this, that, and another. So these are the enduring things, and the problem with them is that if you reach a certain level, especially in a state-controlled media, of intensity, take China and Japan. Even if the Chinese government and Japanese government reach a reconciliation, they're making it more and more difficult to sell those political solutions to their own populations, because then it starts to look like weakness on their part. If China or Japan accommodates each other, and how's Abe going to sell that to the Japanese people, who are just as pumped up over the island disputes as the Chinese people are? So that's the one thing that worries me, and I think that's trending visibly and almost irreversibly in a very bad direction. So I look for some sign that the media is going to let up, especially the state-controlled media. We have a lot of diversity in opinions here, so there's an awful lot of, especially around presidential elections, there's always a lot of anti-Chinese media coverage about job losses and all that sort of things, currency manipulation and whatnot. But I think, I think I tend to agree with Rach. I think that we're on a course of opening up, which is almost irreversible. There's this huge population that's outbound, enormous economic engagement outside of China.
And cultural engagement. You have Gao Xingjian. We had a Chinese Nobel laureate for the first time. And I know, China has, of course, disowned him, and yet he represents. And you have Chinese films, you have indie Chinese filmmakers winning Berlin year after year, winning prestigious film competitions. So I think the cultural cat is out of the bag, whether the central government is applauding that or decrying it. I think it's good news. I think it's impossible to reverse those progresses.
Yeah. So, that's looking for that balance point, but you can't predict I just don't think there's any real basis to predict behavior of systems in which so much power is concentrated in a few individuals at the top. I mean, certainly in Russia, I think Putin is blamed for sort of everything that's happening now. There's no talk about other, foreign minister or anybody else. They're basically all representing his viewpoint. And Xi Jinping, this is the other side of the story of Xi Jinping's being such a powerful leader. He's got 9 titles now. And most people do agree, and I would tend to agree. I don't know if all of you back here, I'm sure, have views that are better, more informed than my view, but I think the general sense is he's probably has the most complete concentration of authority across both military and civilian sectors of anybody since Deng Xiaoping. I think there's general consensus that that's the case. I don't know if I'm going too far afield there, but having said that, that does mean he can move things in directions that he may decide may look right to him, but may not be in the long-term best interest. I want to come back a little bit to this question, though. The thing that surprised me about New Year's this year is actually Xi Jinping was criticized fairly severely from inside the party. And I was taken aback by that, but some, the few princelings I know who talk about these things tell me that in these presentations, in both this one and the ones that from his Oval Office, so to speak, and other things, he gave too much attention to retired generals. So the core political issue right now is whether or not he can get on top of Zhou Yongkang. Again, we're getting a little bit deep into some of the darker political corners, but Zhou Yongkang is a Bo Xilai loyalist, former CEO of CNPC, the China National Petroleum Corporation, PetroChina, very powerful figure. CNPC and the whole oil and gas sector in China has not been the most obedient sector to Party Central. They represent interests that you might call a different faction. So we've seen a number of, if you look at all the high-profile corruption cases, including Bo Xilai, and then what's his name, Zhang Jieshi, right, the successor to Zhou Yongkang as CEO of CNPC, and there's something Ding Chun, Li Han in Sichuan. These are all a number of people that are clearly in Bo Xilai's camp, but they're also oil and gas people or resource people. Everybody expected Xi Jinping to do better in getting Zhou Yongkang arrested and investigated, and to this day he still hasn't been able to get that done conclusively. And that has been tied back to his New Year's presentation, because they're pecanologists, inside China and outside China. And what they are saying, for better or worse, this is not my idea, it's their idea, is that the anti-corruption campaign on the generals has been too severe. There's a General Gu who has also been caught up, enmeshed in this. And as a result, he's losing his support in that part of the system. And the symbolism of his appearances at New Year's basically made this very, very clear. So I'm not in a position to judge whether this is right or wrong. I'm only telling you what people are talking about. But I've heard for the first time, someone said to me just a week ago, he said, remember that almost up until the time that Deng Xiaoping became China's supreme leader, which he did with no positions, he was in jail. And you can interpret that however you wish, depending on how closely you follow Bo Xilai and others. But that's sort of the conversation that goes on. Again, right or wrong, I don't really know. But these New Year's appearances then were full of hints, at least perceived hints by some people about what might be going on. So you probably have more access to more people who know than I do. But I don't know if that makes sense to you or sounds ridiculous. You're not going to get me off the hook.
Thank you. Regarding the Chinese censorship's relationship with Western media, you mentioned how they're really shutting the New York Times and other investigative journalism organizations out. Some of what I see sometimes is that Chinese media will actually really selectively quote Western media, like from Reuters, and use those quotes in a way to sort of further the party's message, so that they're giving this appearance of opening up and modernization. And what I think this is, it's sort of indicative of this kind of appearance of modernization and opening up, while they're still furthering the same messages just in a much more subtle way. And I think that's kind of opposed to what we're talking about, like the clamping down. I think that's happening much less, and a sort of selective censorship that's a lot harder to detect, but just as powerful as happening. So,
yeah.
Comments?
No, I think that's a great comment. And I think that one of the things that is indisputable is that the public relations sophistication of both corporate China and political China is far beyond what it was even 5 years ago. And I think that they understand the appetite for reform both domestically and internationally. You know, multinational corporations involved in China are desperate for state-owned enterprise reform. Because it's utterly necessary to have any kind of level playing field. You've got to get subsidies out of the system. You've got to get preferential treatment out of the system. And the citizens themselves, you know, really want an end to the imbalance in the amount of wealth the state keeps in terms of the amount of wealth that's distributed to people. So, you know, here in the United States, 75% of sort of our per capita wealth production goes to people to spend, goes to households to spend. In China, that number is about 35%. So it enables big projects. It enables the world's largest bridge between Dalian and Yantai, which is an unbelievable project. But you know, you can only enable a project with government spending if the government keeps that much money. So again, at this event I was at Tsinghua University last week, people were standing up in the audience. I was kind of stunned, angrily talking about how little money they as citizens were getting from the wealth that China has generated. I hadn't heard that before. So the appetite for reform domestically is very, very, very strong. So we've had extremely strong messages about reform, going back, you know, to October of last year, going back to the third plenary in November, reiterated for the 2 meetings in March, associated with the Shanghai Pilot Free Trade Zone. These messages have been extremely strong and have been picked up both domestically and globally. But you do have the other side of the people, of the story. On this panel last week was the China bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal, Bob Davis, and he said, "Where's the beef?" He quoted actually, I think it was a Ronald Reagan exchange years and years ago. He said, "This is what the world was waiting to see, is what steps you're actually going to take, concrete steps you're going to actually take toward reform." You know, and they're not talking really about the top tier issues like interest rate liberalization and things of that sort. They're talking about really trying to put the market into place in that economy in a much more significant and powerful place than it's occupied in the past. So, yeah, but the public relations side of things is really way, way beyond what it used to be. And I think Chinese are having more success with outbound investment, like CNOOC coming into the Nexen oil sands project, because they're doing their public relations work better. And they're making the right points. I don't know.
Also related in the conversation about public relations and what version of events or information you disseminate and what you mean by it, I think it's worth thinking about propaganda and the question of whether propaganda is designed to persuade. I think it's not. I think propaganda is a show of power. It's just about saying, here's the line officialdom is going to take, and no matter how outrageous or egregiously dishonest it is, I dare you. I dare you to confront us. I dare you to contradict it. So I don't think that the goal necessarily of using information or presenting information in whatever way a party decides to is necessarily about persuading people that what they're saying is actually happening.
Yeah, which is a great example is the Kunming train incident.
Right.
Because, you know, well, you Chinese who know China well, how many Uyghurs are there in Yunnan province? Yeah, none. Everybody's shaking their heads. There are no Uyghurs in Yunnan province. It's not to say that Uyghurs couldn't go to Yunnan province, but the notable thing about the coverage of that is you get the historical determination,
right,
which is set down kind of definitively, in exactly the same way that emperors used to write the history of the previous dynasty. You get the historical determination, the correct interpretation of events. We have seen no pictures of any of the perpetrators. No pictures of any of the interpretations. No eyewitness accounts of what happened. In the story itself, the investigation was completed actually in 15 minutes after the event, in which a brave local guard shot 5 perpetrators in about 15 seconds. So the feasibility of that solution itself is kind of called into question, but the lack of any real data or any real information, but the determination is very quick and clean. And you know, if you can, we have any Uyghurs here? If you could blame Uyghurs, it holds the party kind of harmless. You know, this is the one thing they're not, these are separatists. They're disloyal, they're traitors. If it were local disgruntled citizens who were responding to a land grab or extortion or some sort of social abuse, it's a problem for the party. So the Uyghur explanation now explains everything, every kind of social disruption. The Jeep in Tiananmen driving into the crowd there in the Kunming. So you will continue to see more and more things blamed on Uyghurs. Again, which has the same sort of non-salutary effect of blaming the Japanese or blaming the Americans or, you know, creating tensions among people. Yeah, did you want to? Oh.
And I worked for the Korean government for a year, so I was really, thank you. I was really feeling disappointed when I heard the news about the Kunming stabbing. I feel like what you're saying is true, but at the same time, I want to see, I was expecting like the foreign media to cover more, to give me more data and truth, but I didn't see any. I feel like nobody cares. And like the Chinese government, it just, you know, didn't show me anything. So I have no idea how to look for information, how to prove like my people, like Xinjiang people, we didn't do this. So that's one thing. And there is riots in 2008. Like there is really a massive stabbing back then. And what the government did is shut down the internet for like a year. So like we couldn't get out, like really reach out a lot of information that we want. So do you think like, I think the government is trying not to do this anymore, but at the same time, they're not really open up to all the media. Do you think like this kind of openness or like the advancement of technology is going to help social movement, or do you think it's not going to work?
Well, I think inevitably it does, because the only steps that really work are extreme steps, which any modern economy can't afford to take. You have to go back to kind of a North Korea situation almost, where you just eliminate wireless connectivity for your citizens, and the economy, that would exact an enormous toll from the Chinese economy right now, not to mention the life that people have become accustomed to. So it's not a viable solution. But you do have, I think, one thing in the favor of more liberalization, and that is that the regulators themselves are extremely confused now about what their turf is. Because technology has brought a convergence of the historical roles of regulators. So, you know, Rach mentioned SARF, the State Administration of Radio, Film, and Television. They report up to the Propaganda Bureau, and reporting up to them is the Chinese Film Association. So the Chinese Film Association wants to make money. SARF wants to keep content in traditional channels healthy content. But, you know, the Ministry of Culture has had a big role in defining the areas of proper public discourse. And then the Ministry of the MIIT, now formerly MITI, formerly MPT, the Ministry of Post and Telecommunications, has governed the channels. So convergence now, where you have, you know, wireless channels, mobility covering a lot of TV content or video content, streaming, and all of these things happening. The ministries themselves that have, as you know, in China, you have very weak, what you might call peer bonding or peer authority from ministry to ministry along sort of horizontally equivalent lines, which is one of the aggravating things for foreigners in China, is you get a lot of contradictory guidance and dictates and authorities converging. Well, this is the sort of biggest example of that kind of problem. Is in regulating this media. So the confusion among regulators is something that's very much the advantage of people who are looking for areas that they can kind of navigate through, right? So that's a move toward liberalization.
And as an offshoot of that, none of these, even these individual organizations, are not monoliths. So in any organization, on Weibo, for example, one of the most active groups on Weibo are police forces. Police forces have huge, both coherent and totally incoherent and individualized presence on Chinese Twitter. So you have, in fact, a lot of officials tweeting their personal opinions, retweeting things that they weren't supposed to. It's very difficult to organize even the individuals in the organizations which should be organized. Which is good news if you want free speech. Good news if you want to upload your rabbit content.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, it's not just in Xinjiang, but there was an incident not too long ago in Beijing. And we had the video here, but Rachel thought it was too far over the line to show. Where a migrant from, a YD person from Anhui province working in a department store was either fell off or was thrown off the 10th story of one of the big shopping malls in Beijing. And the official police story, which came out almost immediately, was that she had committed suicide, which happens with YD people in Foxconn factories and in all sorts of settings. But in the world of internet communication in Weibo, a completely different story was propagated, that she had been gang raped by the Gonganju, the Public Security Bureau, and then they threw her off of the top of the building. And that story was deeply believed. So there are huge demonstrations there, right in Beijing. It's a little bit to the side of Beijing. I mean, it's not the absolute downtown area. And immediately there was huge censorship pressure on Sina Weibo. But the discussion was picked up on WeChat immediately, and the discussion couldn't be killed. It would not die. And it resulted in very large demonstrations because you have now the potential for, what you might call virtual assembly. So while physical assembly can still be curtailed, as it was, say, after the Jasmine revolutions, virtual assembly is much more difficult to curtail, and it can result in physical assembly, as we saw in Beijing. So that story continues to be very, very alive on WeChat, but officially is completely condemned. So it is nothing about that incident has been mentioned in any of the official newspapers or on TV. Nothing about it. Even the government story of it has not been mentioned. But it, as I say, remains very alive on the internet in the kind of peer-to-peer communication world. So it is very difficult to begin to filter these things out. As Rach says, you can set your filters to block and immediately delete any message that says Ai Weiwei, but you can't do it for Ai Weilai or Ai Weiguo or the million variants that are completely transparent to users.
And even the content itself is so volatile. So you think of an example like the bullet train accident in Wenzhou, in the inaugural journey of the bullet train when it crashed. And the first SOS calls came from Sina Weibo. They came and QQ, people SMS to help. And it started as this tremendous, forceful, and positive story about these channels of communication. And then quickly, as these things do, it turned to criticism of the government's response. It wasn't quick enough, they hid the damage, people died needlessly, and then the government tried to shut down part of it, but not all of it. And so it's very difficult. Even, the suicide murder story is a more obvious example, since it's just a bad story almost no matter what. They would rather put it away. But sometimes these stories have content that's valuable. And so shutting everything down entirely, first of all, I think would lead to civil insurrection like we haven't seen ever. I don't think that Weibo or WeChat or the internet can be shut down totally. It's an impossibility. People would be enraged. And I think there's so much positive impact that these stories can have for the government, that it's just a constant whack-a-mole. It's kind of a constant or a cat and mouse game.
You guys want to do one more?
Yeah.
Or maybe take two from the floor.
Yes. As I've been listening, it seems to me, not only from the top down and bottom up, but each thing that's done, whether it's propaganda, etc., has some meaning. Nothing can be taken for granted. So going back to one of the first videos where you had, I think it was this New Year's or the gala, where you had, as everybody's saying, a boring scene. If in fact every single thing is important, obviously in economics and politics, etc., I looked at kind of the ridiculous ballet, but then I looked at the backdrop. And the backdrop to me was China as it looked in art from centuries ago. And so if everything has some meaning, if it all has a point, that particular backdrop, which was so essential, it seemed, in terms of the beautiful landscape, the water, the mountain, the whatever, why that? I mean, if everything else has some meaning, what was being supposedly shown in that you would
Well, I think there's
recognize?
A patriotic desire to convey to people that China has a long, deep history and a lot of natural beauty. You know, they've franchised the Olympic opening ceremony. I think of it because in terms of backdrops, we were in Guilin last summer and went and saw the kind of imported, adapted version of the Olympic opening ceremony sat literally against a river, the Li River, and these enormous karst mountains. And the scale of it was astronomical, as with most Chinese performance and kind of Chinese, the Great Wall. There's always the scale of human labor or kind of involvement in each performance or set piece is always totally stunning. And I think it was a very modern dance performance set against an absolutely antique landscape. So I think that's actually a common way of delivering beauty.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think this is a matter of enormous and justifiable pride because, I mean, really until about 1842, when the British steamed up the Yangtze River and, you know, the first Opium War led to the first of the unequal treaties, China did have certainly the longest continuous civilization in the world and the most powerful economy in the world. They were not extremely outward oriented, but nonetheless, it's a very distinguished history. So you see this played through continuously in a lot of different fora. And then there is the notion too, closely related to that China is very, very capable of learning from the rest of the world. Actually, one of the things we didn't show, we had a bunch of videos that we considered showing. There's also from the New Year's Gala. You might have found this as bizarre as the ballet. There's a duet. A French singer is invited to participate. It comes out and there's kind of a ritual humiliation about her inability to speak Chinese. So that's how it begins. She says a few words, really bumbling, and everybody says, you know, you speak such good Chinese. And then they bring out a young Chinese man to sing this duet with her who speaks perfect French. So they sing the duet, and I wanted to do this as a prelude to Foreign Babes because there's one scene in the middle of this duet, again, this was just a few weeks ago, where he kind of tentatively holds her hand. It's very countercultural in some respect, but the camera zooms in on it. You watch them holding hands for a while. But the backdrop, and it's such a great point you make, because true. The backdrop, someone should do all the backdrops of the New Year's Gala. What do they have coming into focus in the back is a Chinese paper-cut version of the Arc de Triomphe. It's just it couldn't be more perfect. How perfect is that? Do we have time for one more?
Actually, we're over time, so would you guys mind sticking around?
No, we're
not even a
happy to
little.
do that.
We'll hang out. Thank you for having us.
So please join me in thanking you.
Thank you very much.